Swann's Way by Marcel Proust. Chapter 1. For a long time I went to bed early. Sometimes, my candle scarcely out, my eyes would close so quickly that I did not have time to say to myself, "I'm falling asleep." And half an hour later, the thought that it was time to try to sleep would wake me. I wanted to put down the book I thought I still had in my hand and blow out my light. I had not ceased while sleeping to form reflections on what I had just read, but these reflections had taken a rather peculiar turn. It seemed to me that I myself was what the book was talking about. A church, a quartet, the rivalry between Francois I and Charles V. This belief lived on for a few seconds after my waking. It did not shock my reason, but lay heavy like scales on my eyes and kept them from realizing that the candlestick was no longer lit. Then it began to grow unintelligible to me, as after mentum psychosis do the thoughts of an earlier existence. The subject of the book detached itself from me. I was free to apply myself to it or not. Immediately I recovered my sight, and I was amazed to find the darkness around me soft and restful for my eyes, but perhaps even more so for my mind, to which it appeared a thing without cause, incomprehensible, a thing truly dark. I would ask myself what time it might be. I could hear the whistling of the trains which, remote or nearby, like the singing of a bird in a forest, plodding the distances, described to me the extent of the deserted countryside where the traveler hastens toward the nearest station. And the little road he is following will be engraved on his memory by the excitement he owes to new places, to unaccustomed activities, to the recent conversation, and the farewells under the unfamiliar lamp that follow him still through the silence of the night, to the imminent sweetness of his return. I would rest my cheeks tenderly against the lovely cheeks of the pillow, which, full and fresh, are like the cheeks of our childhood. I would strike a match to look at my watch. Nearly midnight. This is the hour when the invalid who has been obliged to go off on a journey and has had to sleep in an unfamiliar hotel, wakened by an attack, is cheered to see a ray of light under the door. How fortunate! It's already morning. In a moment the servants will be up. He will be able to ring. Someone will come to help him. The hope of being relieved gives him the courage to suffer. In fact, he thought he heard footsteps. The footsteps approach, then recede, and the ray of light that was under his door has disappeared. It is midnight. They have just turned off the gas. The last servant has gone, and he will have to suffer the whole night through without remedy. I would go back to sleep, and would sometimes afterward wake again for brief moments only, long enough to hear the organic creak of the woodwork, open my eyes and stare at the kaleidoscope of the darkness, savor in a momentary glitter of consciousness the sleep into which were plunged the furniture, the room, that whole of which I was only a small part and whose insensibility I would soon return to share. Or else, while sleeping, I had effortlessly returned to a period of my early life that had ended forever, rediscovered one of my childish terrors, such as my great-uncle pulling me by my curls, a terror dispelled on the dawn for me of a new era, when they would cut off. I had forgotten that events during my sleep. I recovered its memory as soon as I managed to wake myself up to escape the hands of my great-uncle. But as a precautionary measure, I would completely surround my head with my pillow before returning to the world of dreams. Sometimes, as Eve was born from one of Adam's ribs, a woman was born during my sleep from a cramped position of my thigh. Formed from the pleasure I was on the point of enjoying, she, I imagined, was the one offering it to me. My body, which felt in hers my own warmth, would try to find itself inside her. I would wake up. The rest of humanity seemed very remote, compared with this woman I had left scarcely a few moments before. My cheek was still warm from her kiss, my body aching from the weight of hers. If, as sometimes happened, she had the features of a woman I had known in life, I would devote myself entirely to this end, to finding her again, like those who go off on a journey to see a longed-for city with their own eyes and imagine that one can enjoy in reality the charm of a dream. Little by little, the memory of her would fade. I had forgotten the girl of my dream. A sleeping man holds in a circle around him the sequence of the hours, the order of the years and worlds. He consults them instinctively as he wakes and reads in a second the point on the earth he occupies, the time that has elapsed before his waking. But the ranks can be mixed up, broken. If, toward morning, after a bout of insomnia, the one in which he usually sleeps, his raised arm alone is enough to stop the sun and make it retreat, and in the first minute of his waking, he will no longer know what time it is. He will think he has only just gone to bed. If he dozes off in a position still more displaced and divergent, after dinner sitting in an armchair for instance, then the confusion among the disordered worlds will be complete. The magic armchair will send him traveling at top speed through time and space, and at the moment of opening his eyelids, he will believe he went to bed several months earlier in another country. But it was enough if, in my own bed, my sleep was deep and allowed my mind to relax entirely. Then it would let go of the map of the place where I had fallen asleep, and when I woke in the middle of the night, since I did not know where I was, I did not even understand in the first moment who I was. I had only, in its original simplicity, that sense of existence as it may quiver in the depths of an animal. I was more destitute than a cave dweller. But then the memory, not yet of the place where I was, but of several of those where I had lived and where I might have been, would come to me like help from on high, to pull me out of the void from which I could not have got out on my own. I crossed centuries of civilization in 1 second, in the image confusedly glimpsed of oil lamps, then of wing collar shirts, gradually recomposed myself's original features. Perhaps the most immobility of the things around us is imposed on them by our certainty that they are themselves and not anything else, by the immobility of our mind confronting them. However that may be, when I woke thus, my mind restlessly attempting, without success, to discover where I was, everything revolved around me in the darkness. Things, countries, years. My body, too benumbed to move, would try to locate, according to the form of its fatigue, the position of its limbs so as to deduce from this the direction of the wall, the placements of the furniture, so as to reconstruct and name the dwelling in which it found itself. Its memory, the memory of its ribs, its knees, its shoulders, offered in succession several of the rooms where it had slept, while around it the invisible walls, changing places according to the shape of the imagined room, spun through the shadows. And even before my mind, hesitating on the thresholds of time and shapes, had identified the house by resembling the circumstances, it, my body, recalled the kind of bed in each one, the location of the doors, the angle at which the lights came in through the windows, the existence of a hallway, along with the thoughts I had had as I fell asleep, and that I had recovered upon waking. My stiffened side, trying to guess its orientation, would imagine, for instance, that it lay facing the wall in a big canopied bed, and immediately I would say to myself, "Why, I went to sleep in the end even though Mama didn't come to say goodnight to me." I was in the country in the home of my grandfather, dead for many years. And my body, the side on which I was resting, faithful guardians of a past my mind ought never to have forgotten, recalled to me the flame of the night light of the Bohemian glass, in the shape of an urn, which hung from the ceiling by little chains, the mantelpiece of Sienna marble, in my bedroom at Cambrai, and my grandparents' house, in faraway days which at this moment I imagined were present, without picturing them to myself exactly, and which I would see more clearly in a little while when I was fully awake. Then the memory of a new position would reappear. The wall would slip away in another direction. I was in my room at Madame de Saint Loup's, in the country. Good Lord, it's 10 o'clock or even later. They will have finished dinner. I must have overslept during the nap I take every evening when I come back from my walk with Madame de Saint Loup, before putting on my evening clothes. For many years have passed since Cambrai, where, however later we returned, it was the sunset's red reflections I saw in the panes of my window. It is another sort of life one leads at Tansonville, at Mayhem St. Luke's, another sort of pleasure I take in going out only at night, in following by moonlight those lanes where I used to play in the sun. In the room where I fell asleep instead of dressing for dinner, from far off I can see it, as we come back, pierced by the flares of the lamp, a lone beacon in the night. These revolting, confused evocations never lasted for more than a few seconds. In my brief uncertainty about where I was, I did not distinguish the various suppositions of which it was composed any better than we isolate, when we see a horse run, the successive positions shown to us by a kinetoscope. But I had seen sometimes one, sometimes another, of the bedrooms I had inhabited in my life, and in the end I would recall them all in the long reveries that followed my waking. Winter bedrooms in which, as soon as you are in bed, you bury your head in the nest braided of the most disparate things. A corner of the pillow, the top of the covers, a bit of shawl, the side of the bed and an issue of de Botte's roses, which you end up by cementing together using the bird's technique of pressing down on it indefinitely. Where in icy weather the pleasure you enjoy is a feeling that you are separated from the outdoors, like the sea swallow which makes its nest deep in an underground passage in the warmth of the earth, and where, since the fire is kept burning all night in the fireplace, you sleep in a great cloak of warm, smoky air, shot with the glimmers from the logs breaking into flames again, a sort of immaterial alcove, a warm cave dug out of the heart of the room itself, a zone of heat with shifting thermal contours, aerated by drafts which cool your face and come from the corners, from the parts close to the window or far from the hearth, and which have grown cold again. Summer bedrooms where you delight in becoming one with the soft night, where the moonlight leaning against the half-open shutters casts its enchanted ladder to the foot of the bed, where you sleep almost in the open air, like a titmouse rocked by the breeze on the tip of a ray of light. Sometimes the Louis XIV bedroom, so cheerful that even on the first night I had not been too unhappy there, and where the slender columns that lightly supported the ceiling stood aside with such grace, to show and reserve the place where the bed was. At other times, the small bedroom with the very high ceiling, hollowed out in the form of a pyramid 2 stories high and partly panelled in mahogany, where from the first second I had been mentally poisoned by the unfamiliar odor of the vetiver, convinced of the hostility of the violet curtains and the insolent indifference of the clock clattering loudly as though I was not there, where a strange and pitiless quadrangular cheval glass, barring obliquely one of the corners of the room, carved from deep inside the soft fullness of my usual field of vision a sight for itself, which I had not expected, where my mind, struggling for hours to dislodge itself, to stretch upward so as to assume the exact shape of the room and succeed in filling its gigantic funnel to the very top, had suffered many hard nights, while I lay stretched out on my bed, my eyes lifted, my ear anxious, my nostril restive, my heart pounding, until habit had changed the color of the curtains, silenced the clock, taught pity to the cruel oblique mirror, concealed, if not driven out completely, the smell of the vetiver, and appreciably diminished the apparent height of the ceiling. Habit, that skillful but very slow housekeeper who begins by letting our minds suffer for weeks in a temporary arrangement, but whom we are nevertheless truly happy to discover, for without habit our mind, reduced to no more than its own resources, would be powerless to make a lodging habitable. Certainly I was now wide awake. My body had veered around one last time, and the good angel of certainty had brought everything around me to a standstill, laying me down under my covers, in my bedroom, and put approximately where they belonged in the darkness my chest of drawers, my desk, my fireplace, the window onto the streets and the 2 doors. But even though I knew I was not in any of the houses of which my ignorance upon waking had instantly, if not presented me with a distinct picture, at least made me believe the presence possible, my memory had been stirred. Generally, I would not try to go back to sleep right away. I would spend the greater part of the night remembering our life in the old days, in Cambrai at my great-aunt's house, in Baalbec, in Paris, in Doncières, in Venice, Elsewhere still, remembering the places, the people I had known there, what I had seen of them, what I have been told about them. At Cambrai, every day, in the late afternoon, long before the moment when I would have to go to bed and stay there, without sleeping, far away from my mother and grandmother, my bedroom again became the fixed and painful focus of my preoccupations. They had indeed hit upon the idea, to distract me on the evenings when they found me looking too unhappy, of giving me a magic lantern, which, while awaiting the dinner hour, they would set on top of my lamp. And, after the fashion of the first architects and master glaziers of the Gothic age, it replaced the opacity of the walls with impalpable iridescences, supernatural multicolored apparitions, where legend were depicted as in a wavering, momentary stained glass window. But my sadness was only increased by this, since the mere chance in lighting destroyed the familiarity which my bedroom had acquired for me, and which, except for the torment of going to bed, had made it tolerable to me. Now I no longer recognized it, and I was uneasy there, as in a room in some hotel or chalet, to which I had come for the first time straight from the railway station. Moving at the jerky pace of his horse, and filled with a hideous design, Golo would come out of the triangular forest that velveted the hillside with dark green, and advance jolting toward the castle of poor Genevieve de Brabant. This castle was cut off along a curved line that was actually the edge of one of the glass ovals arranged in the frame, which you slipped between the grooves of the lantern. It was only a section of castle, and it had a moor in front of it, where Genevieve stood dreaming, wearing a blue belt. The castle and the moor were yellow, and I had not had to wait to see them to find out their color, since, before the glasses of the frame did so, the bronze sonority of the name Brabant had shown it to me clearly. Golo would stop for a moment to listen sadly to the platter, read out loud by my great aunt, which he seemed to understand perfectly, modifying his posture with a meekness that did not exclude a certain majesty, to conform to the directions of the text. Then he moved off at the same jerky pace, and nothing could stop his slow ride. If the lantern was moved, I could make out Golo's horse continuing to advance over the window curtains, swelling out with their folds, descending into their fissures. The body of Golo himself, in its essence as supernatural as that of his steed, accommodated every material obstacle, every hindersome object that he encountered, by taking it as his skeleton and as absorbing it into himself. Even the doorknob he immediately adapted to, and floated invincibly over with his red robe, or his pale face, as noble and as melancholy as ever, but revealing no disturbance at this transverberation. Certainly I found some charm in these brilliant projections, which seemed to emanate from a Merovingian past and set out around me such ancient reflections of history. But I cannot express the uneasiness caused in me by this intrusion of mystery and beauty into a room I had at last filled with myself to the point of paying no more attention to the room than to that self. The anesthetizing influence of habits have ceased. I would begin to have thoughts and feelings, and they are such sad things. That doorknob of my room, which differed for me from all other doorknobs in the world in that it seemed to open of its own accord, without my having to turn it, so unconscious had its handling become for me, was now serving as an astral body for Golo. And as soon as they ran for dinner, I hastened to run to the dining room, where the bag-hanging lamp, ignorant of Golo and Bluebeard, and well acquainted with my family and beef casserole, shed the same light as on every other evening, and to fall into the arms of Mamma, whom Genevieve de Brabant's misfortunes made all the dearer to me, while Golo's crimes drove me to examine my own conscience more scrupulously. After dinner, alas, I soon had to leave Mamma, who stayed there talking with the others, in the garden if the weather was fine, in the little drawing-room to which everyone withdrew if the weather was bad. Everyone, except my grandmother, who felt that it's a pity to shut oneself indoors in the country, and who had endless arguments with my father on days when it rained too heavily, because he sent me to read in my room instead of having me stay outdoors. "That's no way to make him strong and active," she would say sadly. "Especially that boy, who so needs to build up his endurance and willpower." My father would shrug his shoulders and study the barometer, for he liked meteorology, while my mother, making no noise as so not to disturb him, watched him with a tender respect, but not so intently as to try to penetrate the mystery of his superior qualities. But as for my grandmother, in all weathers, even in a downpour when Francois had rushed the precious wicker armchairs indoors so that they would not get wet, we would see her in the empty, rain-lashed garden, pushing back her disordered grey locks, so that her forehead could more freely drink in the salubriousness of the wind and rain. She would say, "At last! One can breathe!" and would roam the soaked paths, too symmetrically aligned for her liking by the new gardener, who lacked all feeling for nature and whom my father had been asking since morning if the weather would clear, with her jerky, enthusiastic little step, regulated by the various emotions excited in her soul by the intoxication of the storm, the power of good health, the stupidity of my upbringing, and the symmetry of the gardens, rather than by the desire, quite unknown to her, to spare her plum-colored skirt the spots of mud under which it would disappear up to a height that was always, for her maid, a source of despair and a problem. When these garden walks of my grandmother's took place after dinner, one thing had the power to make her come inside again. This was, at one of the periodic intervals, when her circular itinerary brought her back, like an insect, in front of the lights of the little drawing room where the liqueurs were set out on the card table. If my great aunts called out to her, "Bathilde, come and stop your husband from drinking cognac," to tease her, in fact, she had brought into my father's family so different a mentality that everyone poked fun at her and tormented her, since liqueurs were forbidden to my grandfather. My great aunts would make him drink a few drops. My poor grandmother would come in, fervently beg her husband not to taste the cognac. He would become angry, drink his mouthful despite her, and my grandmother would go off again, sad, discouraged, yet smiling, for she was so humble at heart and so gentle that her tenderness for others, and the lack of fuss she made over her own person and her sufferings, came together in her gaze in a smile in which, unlike what one sees in the faces of so many people, there was irony only for herself, and for all of us a sort of kiss from her eyes, which could not see those she cherished without caressing them passionately with her gaze. This torture which my great aunt inflicted on her, the spectacle of my grandmother's vain entreaties and of her weakness, defeated in advance, trying uselessly to take the liquored glass away from my grandfather, were the kinds of things which you later become so accustomed to seeing that you smile as you contemplate them and take the part of the persecutor resolutely and gaily enough to persuade yourself privately that no persecution is involved. At that time they filled me with such horror that I would have liked to hit my great aunt. But as soon as I heard, "Bathilde, come and stop your husband from drinking cognac," already a man in my cowardice, I did what we all do, once we are grown up, when confronted with sufferings and injustices. I did not want to see them. I went up to sob at the very top of the house next to the schoolroom, under the roofs, in the little room that smelled of orris roots and was perfumed by a wild blackcurrant bush, which just sprouted out between the stones of the wall and extended a branch of flowers to the half-open window. Intended for a more specialized and more vulgar use, this room, from which during the day you could see all the way to the keep of Rue Saint-Ville-de-Pin, for a long time served me as a refuge, no doubt because it was the only one I was permitted to lock, for all those occupations of mine that demanded an inviolable solitude, reading, reverie, tears, and sensuous pleasure. Alas, I did not know that, much more than her husband's little deviations from his regimen, it was my weak will, my delicate health, the uncertainty they cast on my future, that so sadly preoccupied my grandmother in the course of those incessant perambulations, afternoon and evening, when we would see, as it passed and then passed again, lifted slantwise toward the sky, her beautiful face with its brown furrowed cheeks, which with age had become almost mauve, like the ploughed fields in autumn, crossed, if she was going out, by a veil half raised, while upon them, brought there by the cold or some sad thought, an involuntary tear was always drying. My sole consolation, when I went upstairs for the night, was that Mama would come and kiss me once I was in bed. But this good night lasted so short a time, she went down again so soon, that the moment when I heard her coming up, then the soft sound of her garden dress of blue muslin, hung with little cords of plaited straw, passing along the hallway with its double doors, was for me a painful moment. It ushered in the moments that would follow, in which she would have left me, in which she would have gone back down. So that I came to wish that this good night I loved so much would take place as late as possible, so as to prolong the time of respite in which Mama had not yet come. Sometimes when, after kissing me, she opened the door to go, I wanted to call her back, to say, "Kiss me one more time," but I knew that immediately her face would look vexed, because the concession she was making to my sadness and agitation by coming up to kiss me, by bringing me this kiss of peace, irritated my father, who found these rituals absurd, and she would have liked to try to induce me to lose the need for it, habit for it, far indeed from allowing me to acquire that of asking her, when she was already on the doorstep, for one more kiss. And to see her vexed destroyed all the calm she had brought me a moment before, when she had bent her loving face down over my bed, and held it out to me like a host for communion of peace, from which my lips would draw her real presence in the power to fall asleep. But those evenings, when Mama stayed so short a time in my room, were still sweets compared to the ones when there was company for dinner and when, because of that, she did not come up to say good nights to me. That company was usually limited to Swann, who, apart from a few acquaintances passing through, was almost the only person who came to our house at Cambrai, sometimes for a neighborly dinner, more rarer after that unfortunate marriage of his, because my parents did not want to receive his wife, sometimes after dinner, unexpectedly. On those evenings when, as we sat in front of the house under the large chestnut tree, around the iron table, we heard at the far end of the garden, not the copious high-pitched bell that deafened in passing, with its ferruginous, icy, inexhaustible noise, any person in the household who set it off by coming in without ringing, but the shy, oval, golden double tinkling of the little visitor's bell. Everyone would immediately wonder, "A visitor! Now who can that be?" But we knew very well it could only be Swann. My great aunt, speaking loudly, to set an example, in a tone of voice that she strained to make natural, said not to whisper that way, that nothing is more disagreeable for a visitor just coming in who is led to think that people are saying things he should not hear, and that they would send as a scout my grandmother, who was always glad to have a pretext for taking one more walk around the garden, and who would profit from it by surreptitiously pulling up a few rose stakes on the way, so as to make the roses look a little more natural, like a mother who runs her hand through her son's hair to fluff it up after the barber had flattened it too much. We would all remain hanging on the news my grandmother was going to bring us of the enemy, as though there had been a great number of possible assailants to choose among, and soon afterward my grandfather would say, "I recognize Swann's voice." In fact, one could recognize him only by his voice. It was difficult to make out his face, his aquiline nose, his green eyes under a high forehead, framed by blonde, almost red hair, cut Bresson style, because we kept as little light as possible in the garden, so as to not attract mosquitoes, and I would go off, as though not going for that reason, to say that the syrups should be brought out. My grandmother placed a great deal of importance, considering more amiable, on the idea that they should not seem anything exceptional, and for visitors only. Swann, though much younger, was very attached to my grandfather, who had been one of the closest friends of his father, an excellent man but peculiar, in whom, apparently, a trifle was sometimes enough to interrupt the ardor of his feelings, to change the course of his thinking. Several times a year I would hear my grandfather at the table telling anecdotes, always the same ones, about the behavior of old Swann upon the death of his wife, over whom he had watched day and night. My grandfather, who had not seen him for a long time, had rushed to his side at the estate the Swanns owned in the vicinity of Cambrai, and, so that he would not be present at the coffining, managed to entice him for a while, all in tears, out of the death chamber. They walked a short way in the park, where there was a little sunshine. Suddenly, Swann, taking my grandfather by the arm, cried out, "Oh, my old friend, what a joy it is to be walking here together in such fine weather. Don't you think it's pretty, all these trees, these hawthorns? And my pond, which you've never congratulated me on. You look as sad as an old nightcap. Feel that little breeze? Oh, say what you like, life has something to offer despite everything, my dear Amédée." Suddenly the memory of his dead wife came back to him, and, no doubts feeling it would be too complicated to try to understand how he could have yielded to an impulse of happiness at such a time, he confined himself, in a habitual gesture of his whenever a difficult question came into his mind, to passing his hand over his forehead, wiping his eyes and the lenses of his lorgnon. Yet he could not be consoled for the death of his wife, but during the 2 years he survived her, would say to my grandfather, "It's odd, I think of my poor wife often, but I can't think of her for long at a time." Often, but only a little at a time, like poor old Swann, had become one of my grandfather's favorite phrases, which he uttered apropos of the most different sorts of things. I would have thought Swann's father was a monster, if my grandfather, whom I considered a better judge and whose pronouncements, forming a legal precedent for me, often allowed me later to dismiss offences I might have been inclined to condemn, had not exclaimed, "What? He had a heart of gold."